The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the roar of the winds that tore through the night. The air still smelled of damp earth and broken wood, and the once familiar streets looked like a stranger's land. Amidst the wreckage stood a woman in her late 30s, her arms wrapped around herself as though to shield her from the sight before her. What was once her home lay scattered in fragments, shingles torn away, walls collapsed, memories reduced to splinters. She did not cry at first, she only stared, her mind unwilling to accept what her eyes could not look away from. For years, her home had been her sanctuary, a place where the warmth of family dinners and the quiet peace of evenings after long days of teaching had given her strength. Now it was gone in one violent night. The storm had taken not only wood and brick, but the weight of her memories. She felt a hollowness inside her, as if her own sense of belonging had been ripped away. It was not just a house lying in ruins, it was the story of her life scattered across the ground. Her neighbors wandered the street in the same dazed manner, their faces pale and worn. Some wept openly, some shouted in anger, and others, like her, stood still, caught in the paralysis of loss. She wanted to comfort them, but she could not yet find comfort within herself. Every breath felt heavy, like lifting a stone inside her chest. The thought of starting over felt like an impossible mountain, too steep and too cruel to climb. Days passed in a haze. Relief workers came and went, their voices practical and hurried, offering food and temporary shelter. Yet when night fell, the silence returned. She lay awake on a borrowed cot, the sound of the storm replaying endlessly in her mind, the shattering glass, the groaning beams, the way the walls seemed to give up all at once. In those hours, she felt as fragile as the shards she once stepped carefully around. But even in her despair, something inside her refused to break completely. She could not name it, but it flickered like a faint candle in the dark. Though her spirit bent under the weight of loss, it did not collapse. She rose each morning to walk among the ruins, her hands trembling as she picked up broken frames, books swollen with water, small remnants of her past life. Each fragment reminded her of what was gone, but also of what remained herself, standing, still breathing. She did not yet know it, but in those quiet moments of walking through destruction, she was already beginning to bend without breaking. One morning, as she sifted through the wreckage, an elderly neighbor approached. His steps were slow but steady, his eyes carrying the calm of someone who had weathered many storms in his lifetime. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and without judgment, he simply said that he too once stood where she now stood before the ruins of a life swept away by water years ago. His words were not dressed in false comfort. They were simple, steady, like the quiet strength of oak roots buried deep in the earth. He told her that loss does not vanish overnight, nor does despair disappear in a single act of courage. Instead, healing comes in steps, teeny, stubborn steps, taken one after another. It is not about building everything back at once, but about finding one thing each day worth holding on to. His voice carried the kind of patience that only comes from experience. And though her heart still felt heavy, she listened. For the first time since the storm, she allowed herself to believe that her brokenness did not mean she was defeated. She began small. At first, she cleared a corner of debris, stacking wood, gathering nails, saving what could be saved. Her hands blistered, her back ached, but every small piece lifted from the ground gave her a sense of reclaiming her life. There were days when she faltered, when the enormity of what was lost pressed down so hard she could barely move. She would sit in the rubble and wonder why she should even try, why she should fight against the crushing weight of what the storm had taken. But then she remembered the old man's words that it was not about everything at once, but one step at a time. In those quiet pauses, she discovered resilience was not loud or heroic. It was not the grand gestures of rebuilding entire walls in a day. Instead, it was in the persistence of rising each morning and deciding, even in grief, to begin again. With every nail hammered and every board lifted, she felt her spirit growing roots, gripping deeper into the soil of her own strength. She began speaking more with her neighbors, offering them food she had received from relief workers, helping them salvage pieces of their homes. What surprised her was how much lighter her own burden felt. When she carried even a little of someone else's, she saw in their eyes the same quiet determination that flickered inside her. They, too, were bending under loss, but not breaking. Slowly, the ruins began to shift, not just piles of wood and stone, but lives being pieced back together with patience and resilience. And though her home was still far from whole, she had begun to see that what mattered was not just the walls rising again, but the spirit that refused to be crushed beneath them. Weeks turned into months, and though the scars of the storm still marked the land, something new began to grow in its place. Where there had once been silence, now there was the sound of hammers, saws, and voices rising together in determination. The woman's small steps had become a rhythm, steady and enduring, and her neighbors had begun to follow it. They worked side by side, sharing tools, lifting beams together, offering encouragement when exhaustion threatened to drag them back into despair. Her own home began to take shape, slowly first, a frame, then walls, then the roof that stood against the sky like a promise. But what surprised her most was how many hands had touched those walls. Neighbors who had once been strangers now carried wood for her, hammered nails beside her, and smiled when she stumbled but kept going. In return, she found herself doing the same for them. What started as survival became something deeper, collective rising, each one drawing strength from the other. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber light, she stood outside her half-built home and looked around. The street, once filled with rubble and silence, was alive with movement and laughter. Children played near piles of wood. Women shared meals across folding tables. Men exchanged stories while working side by side. The storm had taken much, but it had also revealed something hidden, how resilient hearts could shine brighter when joined together. She realized then that her true strength had not been in rebuilding her home alone, but in inspiring others to believe they could do the same. Her quiet determination had rippled outward, touching lives she did not even realize were watching. She had bent beneath the weight of loss, but she had not broken, and in that resilience, her community had found the courage to rise again. When the last plank was nailed into place and her home finally stood complete, she did not see it as the end of her journey but as a symbol. A house could be torn down by storms, but resilience lived deeper than walls. It lived in the will to begin again, in the hands that reached out to help, and in the spirit that endured even when all seemed lost. That night, she sat on her porch and listened not to silence, but to the hum of her neighborhood alive once more. And she thought, storms may bend us, but they cannot break what is rooted in hope. Resilience is not about standing unshaken in the face of storms, but about bending and still rising when the winds pass. This story reminds us that what we lose can never outweigh what we carry inside: the will to endure, the strength to rebuild, and the hope to inspire others. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections may give strength to someone else who needs it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you can support the journey by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Together, we keep the spirit of resilience alive.